In this segment on labor unions, I'd like to begin to take a look at trends in unionization of the workforce. To do so, let's review very briefly our concept that the history of American labor is the history of American labor unions. And we saw as the jobs movement picked up and as we started to have people exchanging their labor for a cash wage by working for an employer rather than for themselves in farms, etc., that we saw labor unions begin to enter the picture as a way to try to promote and protect the interests of workers with firms. I indicated a couple of the kind of pivotal figures in American labor. One of them had been Cesar Chavez. The Chavez grape boycott that I referenced between 1967 and 1970 really represented the apex or near the apex of power of labor unions. This was an extraordinary feat for Chavez to be able to pull off, to get grocers throughout the country to not carry wines, to not carry table grapes, to really cut the strength completely out from underneath the producers of grapes in this country, such that many of them failed, and before they all failed, they then chose as a collective of grape producers to bow to the demands of the union. This could not have taken place at such a large scale even a decade before. And as it turns out, it couldn't have taken place a decade or more after either. So the Chavez grape boycotts really represent the apex of labor union power in this country. Another pivotal figure in the labor union history in this country ended up being President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan was elected as kind of a great change, or someone that would bring about great change, would bring about great hope. And we see that the election of President Reagan in 1980 really is a inflection point for many elements within our political society economy, including the strength of labor unions. Ironically, President Reagan was a former labor union president. As an actor, he had become active in the Screen Actors Guild, which is a labor union. He became president of that union following his acting career. And well before he became president, gave him a tremendous platform from which to raise money from other wealthy actors and others within the film and entertainment community. And but he was not a friend of labor, or he wasn't seen as a friend of labor in his campaigns and in his early presidency. In fact, he evidenced that in 1981. In 1981, the air traffic controllers within our nation, who had a contract with the federal government to provide air traffic control at all the municipal airports, they decided to go on strike. And they were trying to renew their contract. They were looking for significant gains. Their incomes were high by today's standards. In today's dollars, their incomes were $150,000 to $180,000 a year. But they also had extremely difficult jobs, tremendous amount of stress. The suicide rate amongst air traffic controllers was amongst the highest in the country. They required high training, high skills, high focus, high demand, difficult job environment, and they believed they needed more, and so they offered to go on strike if they wouldn't get more. And then President Reagan, the CEO of the government, of course, very politely declined and said, no, thank you. Your contract says you will not go on strike, and by the way, if you do, we can summarily dismiss you, and we will. You're terminated if you go on strike. Well, PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union at the time, didn't believe that this would actually take place, so PATCO went ahead and ordered their members to strike, and they did. And President Reagan immediately backfilled the jobs with very well-trained military and former military air traffic controllers. What PATCO hadn't really thought about is this was only several years after the end of the Vietnam conflict. And during that conflict, military air bases throughout the country and throughout the world had ramped up their air traffic considerably, which meant they'd also trained and employed scores of air traffic controllers throughout the world, perhaps hundreds of air traffic controllers that were highly trained on the same systems that were being used in airports across the country. And literally, as air traffic controllers walked off the job, in public airports. These current and former government military workers walked on the job. They were not part of the union, and the union then very quickly saw that this was a strategic error on their part, and that leaving the job was not going to help them. Striking was not going to help them, and they sought to come back. They tried to come back. They tried to cross picket lines, or they tried to come back into the workforce, and the president and his administration said no. We told you that if you left the job, if you struck, then you would be terminated. You have been terminated. There no longer are jobs available for you as air traffic controllers. It ruined the livelihood of hundreds and hundreds of those individuals, of course, perhaps thousands, but it also ruined the labor union movement. And when I say ruined, it represented that it had passed the peak of its power. It had reached an inflection point, and now not only was it declining, as we've seen in a prior graphic, in number of union members as a percentage of the workforce, it now began to decline, a steep decline in influence, such that within a matter of years, by 1990, certainly by 2000, labor unions had become very unpopular. The combination of the organized crime influence within labor unions, and then labor unions having reached too far, wanting too much, at a point where the nation was seeking change, and when the nation had a leader, President Reagan, who was very willing to seek to bring about change, really cut the strength completely out of the labor union movement. Let's move on now and think about another manifestation of that. We know recently that Wisconsin became the 25th state in the country to become a right-to-work state. This happened earlier this year, 2015. Well, what is a right-to-work state? Well, a right-to-work state is a state in which, even if a company has signed a collective bargaining agreement with a union, then that company's workers do not need to become part of that union. In order to work for a company in most other states, if the company is covered by a union collective bargaining agreement and its workers are unionized, then to work for the company, the worker must also be unionized, must agree to union dictums, must pay union dues, etc. Well, in a growing number of states, now literally half of our 50 states, if one wants to work for a firm that has labor union activity within it, one can choose to become a member of the union or can choose not to. You can imagine that this makes it yet more difficult for labor unions, A, to collect members, B, to collect dues, which is the revenue that they use to operate, and C, to have influence throughout different parts of our political and labor market sectors. So right-to-work states and the growth of right-to-work states has been on the rise for a few decades, certainly since the apex of power of labor unions, and we now see that literally half the states in the country are right-to-work states, which is makes it very difficult for labor unions to prosper in those states. Let's look now at some other trends in union membership. I showed you a graph in a previous segment about the percentage intensity of union membership in this country. This graph shows a little bit of that same thing. It doesn't go back as far as the other one did. That one started in 1917, I believe. Here we're starting in 1930. But it shows percentage of employed workers and as members of the labor union. So it reaches an apex and starts to decline. We see here that the decline becomes consistent and dramatic after 1980. That's in part a function of the PATCO disaster. But we also see that as union membership reached its peak in this country, or near its peak, we saw that wage and salary of workers also reached a peak and has been steadily in decline ever since. This tells us something of the strength. This tells us something of the strength and influence of labor unions, not only in terms of the lobbying and the regulatory environment, but their ability to actually get more for their workers. Or as they have a lesser percentage of the workforce that are labor union members, and as they have lesser influence, to actually end up with less for their workers. So we find that worker wages have begun to slide, if not in nominal terms, in real terms, ever since the peak of the labor union movement. In this graphic, we're looking at the productivity and compensation growth and the influence of unions. Once again, here in the goldenrod line, we see a curve that tells us about output or productivity per hour from starting 1949 through 2009. And not surprisingly, with innovations of numerous types, we see that productivity has steadily risen over those decades. And we know that in the early part of those decades, we saw real hourly compensation rise as well. But by the time we hit the apex of union power and the unions began to lose their influence, we saw that productivity and real wages no longer tracked along the same trend line, that the union's ability to be able to extract productivity gains from firms and have them equally shared with their workers no longer was present, and so we see this separation, this divergence of those trend lines, such that productivity has continued to rise, but real wages have become nearly stagnant. In fact, real wages of middle to low income households have been stagnant at best throughout the remaining years. Here we're looking at union membership and middle class incomes generally. This is showing us a similar trend that we've seen in another graphic. As union membership reached a peak, incomes also reached a peak. As union memberships declined, then real middle class incomes have begun to shrink. I don't think that's a surprise to any of us. But here we see a very telling all the way through 2011 and a very consistent trend line with this. It's made it much more difficult for the American worker, manufacturing middle class worker to keep up as they've seen their incomes decline, and they've seen labor union membership and influence and strength decline as well. Here we're looking at income distribution, just a slight departure from this. We see in the red curve over time from 1918 to 2008, we see the share of income going to the top 10%, which would be the owners of production, those firm owners whose profits are being minimized as wages were stronger or increasing for their workers. We see that in the early period of this, when labor unions were not very strong, that was a high percentage. We see that declining dramatically as labor unions increased in strength, and here we see that increase in strength on the blue trend line, and then we see them kind of dance around each other for a period, and then we see as labor unions begin to lose membership, and then certainly as they begin to lose influence, we see that the percentage of income going to the top 10% rises dramatically. We'll talk further about this in our module on income inequality and distribution, which will be the final module for our course. We also then see the continued decline in labor unions, which again doesn't surprise us at this point. As we look at weekly wages by race and union membership, we can see not just race, but males, females, and then by race, we see that those that are unionized in virtually each category have higher levels of wage than those that are not, telling us something of the strength of labor unions even as recently as 2011, which is rather interesting because we've indicated the labor unions have lost a tremendous amount of strength in these years, these decades, but even still, we see that on total, a labor union member's wage will be $988 a week on average, where a non-union member doing the exact same type of work for a similar firm is receiving only $817 a week in wages. The difference in this being the difference of collective bargaining, the difference that influence can have or make when we're contracting, when the union steps in and the union is able to extract gains for the workers under this threat of coordinated and organized strike, of course. We can then see a similar relationship, not in wage now, but in employee benefits, where we see different levels of benefits, different types of benefits, and we can see how those benefits are distributed for union members in the dark blue and non-union members in the light blue. And so we see that unions, once again, are very effective in receiving not just wage gains for their employees or wage compensation for their employees or their members. They're very effective in receiving non-wage or benefit. And this, again, is as recent as 2011. We then see something of union membership by state. The very light colored states are going to be 4.9% union membership or less. These would be concentrated in the South and Southeast. We then see the darkest of states being, darkest color of states being 20% of the workers in those states being union members, 20% or more of them, and those would be New York, Hawaii, Alaska. Each of which are very unionized states. Nevada, interestingly enough, is thought of as a heavily unionized state, but really it's only Las Vegas and the environment surrounding the Las Vegas Strip that is heavily unionized. So we see the disbursement of unions throughout the country, and it's rather interesting. The much of the heartland of the country and the Intermountain states and the Southwest, very low unionization. Lower still in the South and Southeast, of course, but this very large part of the country, which in the middle here, that has very low unionization. Finally, in the statistics, we're looking at union membership by industry. And we see by far the largest industry segment that is unionized is local government. This is going to include different administrative workers, different laborers, different types of service providers. We also see that we have education and health separated from local government, and we have state government and federal government. But if you think about the vast majority of educators are employed by the government, by the state or school districts, etc. So when you parse this out, we can look at this and see literally almost 2/3 of this entire pie is represented by government workers, and government workers of one form or another are the majority of union members today. The private sector exclusively, including leisure and hospitality, retail, construction, transportation, manufacturing, has by far the lowest concentration of union membership of any industries in the country at this point.